to see you all. I tell you what, these are some interesting times that we live in. My name is Harrison. I'm going to try to moderate this conversation among this group of geniuses that we have. My day job is I serve as a proud superintendent in Providence Public Schools, but I also run a national nonprofit called MCEL, Men of Color in Educational Leadership. And our work is really just, it centers on identifying, supporting, caring for males of color, getting into leadership positions. We know that there's a critical shortage, not just in education, but across the border with men in education. So we try to work every day to make sure that we're stepping into that. We've got a great group today, and hopefully that our audience will find great value, hoping you're having a great time in this bond experience. I know that I'm pretty awesome and psyched. I just got out of a session with some amazing folks. Brilliance is just sort of oozing out of every conversation. But we're gonna get started, and I'm gonna go around and ask each panelist to introduce himself. And as you introduce yourself, a little bit about your leadership story, how you got to where you are. So introduce yourself, how you got to where you are. And I always like to celebrate. And then one accomplishment that your organization has made that you're most proud of during this crazy time of the pandemic. So we're gonna start with our brother Green.
Good afternoon, everyone. Harrison, appreciate the opportunity. Bond, thank you for facilitating and putting on the Bond Academy, not letting the pandemic stop the movement. So I'm excited to join. And again, Darrell Green, proud superintendent of the Red Clay Consolidated School District here in Wilmington, Delaware. We are the largest public school district in the state of Delaware, actually one of 19 school districts and the largest, serving approximately 16,000 students, have 28 schools, 30 programs, 5 high schools, and we also charter 2 high schools. So we're the only school district, public school district that serves as an authorizer. All the other charter schools in the state of Delaware are authorized by the state Delaware Department of Education. My leadership journey, man, I'm from the DMV area. Grew up in Prince George's County, graduated from Suitland High School, ended up coming to Delaware by way of the University of Delaware on an athletic scholarship. I was fortunate enough to be a student athlete, ended up just getting an elementary teaching education, had several mentors who just kind of put me on that fast track to leadership. Both from a organizational standpoint, I always sought leadership opportunities, and a former principal of mine encouraged me to go back and get my master's in educational leadership, helped me hone my skills in the academic instructional area. Because, you know, we routinely get typecast as a disciplinarian, you know, and that was kind of the path. And she saw something, so I started doing school improvement work, being a summer school lead, team leader. And then from there, I always sought leadership opportunities, especially those that involved instruction. Again, not to fall into that trap of being the disciplinarian or the administrator who kind of just ran and focused on school climbing. From there, principal, assistant principal, became a director of elementary ed in a neighboring school district, became assistant superintendent, left the school district, ran an office for the Department of Education, Office of Innovation and Improvement under our governor, who instituted a new office. Did that for about 1.5 years before I jumped into my current role. And I've been in here, this is starting my 3rd year. So the pandemic hit actually on my 1st year anniversary is when things kind of kicked off. So I've definitely, it's been baptism by fire, man. But again, I'm excited to be here and learn from my co-hosts and panelists and all the others who are part of the Bond Academy this year.
Brother Parker.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. And again, I will echo the sentiments of being appreciative of Bond for putting on this opportunity for collaboration. Absolutely phenomenal, and my first opportunity to participate. My leadership, well, currently my role, I am executive in residence and program officer at the Charles S. Mott Foundation. It's located in Flint, Michigan, and does a lot of work nationally, even internationally, with grant making around education as well as the environment. I literally just ended my 2nd week in this position. Prior to this, I served for the past 4 years as superintendent in Allentown School District in Allentown, Pennsylvania. 16,000 students in Allentown. I'd say fairly similar size to Superintendent Green and his district. A urban district with a 75% Latinx population, significant issues in terms of our poverty rate. So really steeped in urban education and district turnaround. Prior to that, I served as 4 years as superintendent in Ecorse, Michigan. Ecorse is one of the suburban areas of Detroit. So really similar demographics to the city of Detroit and Detroit Public Schools. And prior to that, my journey was as a teacher, principal, et cetera, in the Detroit Public Schools. So I've been immersed in education, absolutely love the work. My educational journey started born and raised on a farm in Tillatoba, Mississippi, in a town with 95 people. So living a rural life and rural experience, and had the opportunity to attend Howard University, and totally shifted the trajectory of my life and where I was going professionally. From there, transitioned to the University of Michigan, and likewise had mentors just invest in me along the way and ensure that I didn't get typecast into the disciplinarian and focus on instruction and improvement. And I've had a really great opportunity to be a superintendent in 2 different states for the last 8 years. And now the opportunity to leverage policy and partnerships from the philanthropic chair to ensure that we find ways to support educational institutions to meet the needs of children by creating opportunities to leverage outside resources. So thank you again for having me, and look forward to having this conversation.
Superintendent Williams.
So good afternoon, everyone. To Bond, thanks again for keeping your annual conference going on, even though it's virtual. I want to thank all of the presenters. I actually had the pleasure of attending several of the sessions today and the happy hour yesterday. So again, I'm so pleased. So Darrell Williams, Superintendent of Baltimore County Public Schools. I'm a Washingtonian. I grew up in DC. I went to public schools in DC, and I went to a high school, Benjamin Banneker Academic High School, right across the street from Howard University. So everyone knew we were all going to Howard, till I stumbled across a Black college tour and visited Hampton University and saw that wonderful place called Home by the Sea. I drank the Kool-Aid, and that's where I attended. I understand that the rivalry between Howard and Hampton, but they're all good. Came back to DC after I finished Hampton and worked in DC public schools. I was fortunate to go back to my alma mater, which was interesting. But just like anything, you get recruited. I got recruited to come to Montgomery County, and I worked in Montgomery County 25 years before I was appointed as superintendent of Baltimore County Public Schools. I worked my way from classroom teacher, resource teacher, assistant principal. And as you well know, I got a middle school principalship because back then they felt you needed to start small. And I was a middle school principal, and then I was the principal of 2 high schools, Gaithersburg High School and Montgomery Blair High School. Those are stories right there in themselves. This is my second year, Dr. Green. I was appointed first year. At the end of my first year, the pandemic hit. And then this is my second year. And I tell you, if I let my beard grow, I'm sure it will look similar, because no one can really describe the stress that we all had to endure, definitely in the classroom, definitely our leaders, but those who are running a school system. Baltimore County Public Schools is the 3rd largest school system in the state of Maryland. Prior to the pandemic, we had over 115,000 students. I have 24 high schools, about 26 middle schools. 1 school is elementary and middle, and 107 elementary schools. I'm fortunate because I'm able to still stay in the DMV, if you will. That's where I grew up. I bring the inner city experience, the suburban experience in Baltimore County. One would consider is all of that plus rural just because of the demographics. We are 62% minority. Our Black population has grown the last 10 years. The greatest accomplishment was even prior to the pandemic, my first year, we had to change our strategic plan. We updated our strategic plan. We got a lot of feedback. And even in the midst of the pandemic last March, we were able to get that strategic plan completed, approved by the board. And now, although we weren't as aggressive with it this year because of the challenges with the pandemic, we're excited that we see the light at the end of the tunnel, and we still have work to do to close gaps, a lot of achievement gaps, particularly with our African-American students and students receiving services, whether it's special ed or English language learners. So that's who I am.
So there's a thread here. I got appointed in Providence a little bit over a year ago, end of February. 3 weeks later, the pandemic hit. And I didn't have all this gray hair a year ago, but I tell you what, man, it has been an interesting time. So I want to jump into a couple questions. And what I'd like to do is for each one of you to talk a little bit about sort of over the past year. You think about leading your organizations over the past year. What was the most difficult part of being a superintendent in the last year?
Yeah, I'll jump it off. For me, it was actually, and not so much the pandemic, because I think, as Dr. Williams indicated, it's just been a stressful period of time. I mean, the days truly have just been long. I mean, 15, 16-hour days consistently, 7 days a week. This virtual world that we've been in. But the hidden pandemic that was soon to come, which was George Floyd. Just to kind of put it out there, man, and I'm the only superintendent of color currently in the state of Delaware. And so when I'm leading amongst my peers, man, and being in isolation and trying to process things as a man, as a husband, as a father, but then as a school leader, especially when you have a diverse stakeholder community, as I have, and as Dr. Williams alluded to, when you're trying to fight that battle of social justice, racism, institutional, racism, and you get the emails similar to, the LeBron shut up and dribble, and it was just, shut up and lead, reading, writing, math, and not realizing the whole context of what we've been dealing with. Trying to make sure that we stay attuned to student voice and promote student voice. And that was probably one of our biggest accomplishments, was really doubling down on our efforts to stay engaged with our young people and promote youth voice. One of the things that we actually did during the pandemic was to retrofit a school bus and call it the education station, and took it out on the road. And we partnered with our local YMCA to get just testimonies of students to just really see their experience and elevate their voice again, not only in terms of what they've been experiencing relative to the pandemic, but what they've been dealing with as it relates to now not seeing themselves in the curriculum, because life has become their teacher, right? And now they've been passionate about organizing and mobilizing to push legislation to really see themselves represented and what's being taught in the classroom. So really just kind of living multiple pandemics, so to speak, within our community has probably been the most challenging, but also the most rewarding, because I see it as a benefit to be able to lead during such a time as this, and really embracing that opportunity to, not only elevate youth voice, but support our diverse stakeholder group and community here in Red Clay.
So let me just add, Dr. Green, I feel your pain. I'm the only Black male superintendent in the state of Maryland. I will just echo, I'll associate myself with your comments. We were dealing with racism, as well as social injustice, as well as the health pandemic. And to deal with all three, extremely challenging. I would echo, we were doing some race and racism conversations with our staff, with our students, and the pandemic hit. And students and staff members were hurting and wanted to have a voice, and we gave them that voice. I will also add that I have found myself, I'm sure my colleagues the same way, this is a health pandemic. This is not an education pandemic. It wasn't something that Dr. Williams just decided, I'm going to do virtual learning for everybody. And so we had to really partner with our health officials. We have a health advisory to guide us so we can say, this is just not the educators making these statements, but we had to say our health experts, our health officers are saying, this is the best approach to go about even connecting with kids and families. I'm so pleased that you raised what you've done in your district. We did something similar just with food. I was amazed about just the outpour of, families were losing their jobs. They were relocating to other family members. We actually have had our bus drivers to partner with our food and nutrition, and we were having community setups along with our student support network. We were giving out food daily, even on the weekends with many of our volunteers. That became such a support because, students aren't going to learn if they're not ready to learn, and many of them were counting on the school system for the food. So it was a unique partnership on how we got our own bus drivers and their buses and our food and nutrition to really go into the community, especially going into the community and giving out hotspots just to have kids and laptops and having kids and staff. We had some situations we had to work with staff. That's been challenging, extremely challenging, but it was a learning experience because right now we are envisioning, reimagining what public education is going to look like. And if we didn't have strong partnerships before, we definitely have to have strong partnerships now. We talk about our schools are in our communities and they need to be looked at as a community school. And sometimes they weren't, sometimes families didn't feel they were connected or were welcome. And so our whole parent engagement, multi-languages, we're redoing or revamping all of the work that we may have done previously to make sure we meet the needs of our communities and definitely our students.
So I'll add to that just a little bit, and my two colleagues have been very verbose, but I'll say one of the most difficult things, and I think for superintendents across the country, and I'll go old school a little bit with this. My first day as a superintendent, my board president told me, what you better remember as a superintendent is that the board is the dog and the superintendent is the tail, and the tail don't wag the dog. Meaning she let me know at that point to understand that the board is the policy making entity and the superintendent drives policy into action. So the most difficult piece for me around the past year has been really helping process for my board and for my community a lot of the politics that have been playing out in school districts. And Dr. Williams said it best. This isn't an educational pandemic, it's a health pandemic. But the politics around whether it's George Floyd, whether it's the former president, or whether it's the pandemic, are all playing out, and they're playing out in the local grocery store with board members and their community and their constituents, and all of those conversations that happen politically in that larger context come into decision making in the district. And as a superintendent, being able to create the correct and accurate funnel and place and space to drive those conversations in a meaningful and positive way has been absolutely, I think, a challenge for superintendents across the nation. There are a number of articles that have been written over the past month about superintendents and the challenges and transitions that folks have been making. And a lot of that is there's a lot of political pressure that the CEOs and superintendents are facing that isn't different from what's happened in past years, but it's been amplified. And that being amplified means that you have to be really connected to the school board in a meaningful way so that you can understand the issues that they're facing with their constituents in their community, because those are ultimately going to drive some of the challenges that you face in leading the district. And I think just always remembering that as a superintendent, we're setting vision, we're leading the organization, but ultimately working with that school board to ensure that we're understanding and processing their concerns and wishes becomes really important. And I think for a lot of superintendents has been a bit of challenge over the past year.
You know, it's a little bit unsettling that you got 3 male superintendents of color in 3 different states on a call as the only one. I mean, we've got our work cut out for us. I mean, that this is unfortunately not the exception to the rule, it becomes the rule. We know that even before the pandemic, our boys of color were systematically disenfranchised. During the pandemic and almost post-pandemic, we could almost write the script. One of the things that I share with my community throughout this past year is that there is no COVID pass, especially for kids of color. And kids of color, children of color, have been dealing with COVID-like pandemics their entire lives. We talk about George Floyd, but look at communities of color. You're talking about housing, income, diabetes, high blood pressure, racism, police brutality. Like, we've been dealing with COVID type things all of our lives. So I would ask each one of you is talk a little bit about how are you responding to the needs specifically of your boys of color?
Yeah, again, I would generally say just staying connected to the community. First and foremost, allowing them to see me and being accessible, working with various community partners, especially our young men who are deemed, historically would be characterized as at risk, but I say at promise because there's so much hope and promise that lies within them. But it's misunderstood. We're misunderstood, right? Depending on how we show up or what we advocate for, that misunderstanding of who we are, what we represent. And so it's really just been trying to avail ourselves and avail myself, and then being intentional about what are the needs of our young men of color and making sure we direct resources to support. And again, working with advocacy groups, particularly in Wilmington right now in our community, the city of Wilmington, which is the largest city in the state of Delaware, about 72,000 residents, 11,000 school-aged children divided by 4 comprehensive public school districts, a VOTEC school district, and then you throw maybe 20 charter schools per se who have access to that small demographic. Community violence is at an all-time high. If you look at national news per capita, the murder rate, the community violence, the gun rate, gun violence rate, it's a trap, right? And it's happening in every major city across the country, both small and large. And so it's really how do we double down our efforts to be intentional about not just looking at how we support them academically, but from a social emotional standpoint. And the first thing for me is it starts by being accessible. It's funny that I just had to go speak at a funeral for a former student of mine 2 days ago. And literally trying to work with past students. My phone was actually blown up this morning because they're seeking jobs. They want a different way, but no longer can we just keep talking to them and telling them we have to show them. And so through mentorship, how do we look at non-traditional ways of mentorship? And mentorship outside of the school. Going back to Dr. Williams' point, really looking at community schools. But if there are barriers and limitations because the mentors that we need to mentor this current generation may have had a checker pass or things within their background that won't prohibit them to really have access to the school building, how are we extending that and those resources through community centers, community partners within the community? So for me, it's just showing up, man, and being available and accessible to them is rule number 1, because we can preach to them all day long. But this is a different generation that we're dealing with.
Right. I just want to add to that. We got to show them. Yeah, I think Dr. Green said it. You know, we can preach all day long, but we have to show them. And I've been very intentional. And Dr. Parker said it. These things aren't new. Dr. Peters said the same thing. There was this pre-COVID issue that we've been dealing with, and re-engaging our Black males and making sure they're successful. A couple of things are working in my favor is that our board adopted an equity policy last year. So that was a long process, but they got to it, and it's good work. Now we have a policy governing that we got to close these gaps. But it really is grassroots where I'm getting what Dr. Green said, grassroots, that re-engagement. You know, I've been saying to our principals, you know the kids, you can actually you know them by face, you know them by name, you know how many times they've been talking, you've been talking to the mama or daddy. We gotta re-engage those kids that we know have been disengaged even before the pandemic, and especially during the pandemic. And, you know, I'm not ashamed of stealing ideas from others. You know, one of our middle schools, they started something called a Boys to Men Club. All right, so okay, let's continue to fund that so it can start from one middle school and the high school that it feeds into to multiple middle schools. Because I don't know about you all, I am really focusing on my middle school children because there's something about middle school, we know that. You know, this whole concept about bond, you know, I had staff attending. I said, how do we create a bond academy up here in Baltimore County? Because it's a good resource. Again, I'm not afraid of borrowing and stealing and begging, but I want to go back grassroots. I've been pushing our fraternities, our sororities, religious organization, our local, we got 2 NAACP branches, our Randallstown and our Baltimore County, and they've been outreaching to schools, and they've been that grassroots and getting more of the community and organizations to help. For me, it's also this whole recruitment and effort. You know, our Black males, our Black students need to see more of us in schools. And we all know that is a struggle nationally to get more folks into education. But the more I can go out and they can interact with me, the more they can interact with any Black male employee, doesn't have to be a teacher. So there's that engagement and relationships. I just think it's more about action now. And I probably missed out on some of the other organizations, but that grassroots and getting more of our organizations to interact with our Black males, I think will bode us well.
Yeah, and I echo echo the sentiments. A lot of the strategies that you all are using, we're employing as well. The only thing I would add to that, again, as the first African American superintendent in the history of this district, my face, my presence, my being became really important in creating space and opportunity for our young men to believe that they have the capacity and the opportunity. So we invested in also building that social capital at all levels of the organization. So everywhere a child in the Allentown School District would go, they'd have the opportunity to begin to see faces that were similar to them. So we employed our strategy to increase and improve our recruitment of especially males of color, but people of color in general, in our school district, because again, it's about yes, doing programs and yes, doing initiatives, but from an equity standpoint, for me, it's about resource allocation and structural realignment to ensure that the entire organization begins to shift so that at some point we don't have to do extra because our organization recognizes where it is not meeting the needs of kids, of all children in the first place. So shifting structures and organizations. I heard Dr. Williams talk about the equity policy. We implemented our equity policy. We also implemented an equity formula for resource allocation so that, again, we can take all of those factors that our babies are bringing into the classroom into being when we calculate how we employ our resources for our kids. So it's doing some of the programmatic pieces, but also ensuring that over the past year we doubled down on our structural realignment to meet the needs of all kids, and specifically identifying demographic groups to ensure we support it.
So when I think about the work that we have to do in Providence, and I look at a school district that serves 90% students of color. However, my teaching workforce is 80% white, 80% white female mainly white female, that don't even live in the city. What are you doing to attract teachers of color and retain teachers of color?
Yeah, it's a challenge, man. So we're trying to grow our own. One of the things that we have here in Delaware, the career pathways, and one of the many career pathways that are offered are Teachers Academy. And historically, what's happened with the Teachers Academy, there are true tracks. There's the early childhood, and then there's the teaching. And many of the students in my district were steered to early childhood because that was the path of least resistance to actually obtaining employment, right? So there we go and work in childcare centers. And so we're working with community partners. We're working with foundations, the Michael Susan Dell Foundation, Delaware State University, University of Delaware, Wilmington University, to really kind of create these pathways to grow our own. And the bigger thing is I would talk about recruitment. We have to really look at retention and the retention rate and how we're supporting retention. So one of the things that we're actually doing right now is we're looking at a Freedom School in partnership with the Children Defense Fund and in conjunction with Delaware State University and our Newcastle County we just filed for a grant, received a grant for housing and transportation stipends, because there's a gap between where Delaware State University is housed and where we are in Wilmington. So we can't let that distance be a barrier. And so really trying to get educators who are in the pre-service undergrad programs connected to our schools to create residency models, so that not only are you doing your 6-week student teaching, but you're actually in a residency program, a year-long residency program that's supported by the state, that's supported by the district, so that you can go through that pipeline in those high-need schools and then come right in to really address the turnover rate. And a lot of our high-need schools, as you indicated, we place people, but then they transfer out, or they'll get their foot in the door for that period of time. And then when opportunities open in our suburban schools, or they just leave altogether. So, I mean, there are a number of things that I think we have to look at. As much as we want to talk about recruitment, retention is probably more important. How do we retain educators of color and really create? And I think Bond is on to something, just being able to have this forum, because I can tell you right now, man, I feel good just hearing Dr. Parker, Dr. Williams, and you, Dr. Peters, just in terms of what your experiences are, to know that I'm not alone. But more importantly, the way I'm leading and how I'm leading, it's affirming, right? And too often when we do it in isolation, it's a struggle. And we know many of our educators find themselves in the same position that we are as leaders within the classroom. They're the only educator of color within a particular school or at a particular grade level. So how do we really look at retention as much as it talks about recruitment?
So I'll just add, I remember as you were talking, Dr. Green, I remember as a first-year teacher, my mentor said to me, stay out of this teacher lounge. Don't go into the teacher lounge. You got to eat your lunch. Just go on to stay in the classroom. And I chuckle about it because I didn't think it was true, but I think a big piece is we have to make sure our teachers are saying that the profession is worthwhile for others to go in. Everything's not perfect. We're working on it. But if we're not selling our own profession or not encouraging students, then that's a missed opportunity. For me, what I'm seeing, as I've done, as you all have done, a new superintendent coming in, talking to so many people, a couple of things that come to mind. Yes, the recruitment, but to keep teachers, bottom line is the salary. salaries, what they're teaching or their teaching assignment, and the work conditions and what kind of professional development. And so I'm even looking at all of those because it's hard to recruit. We don't have the numbers that we have locally, so we have to, travel the world, try to find some staff. But if we're not making our salaries competitive, you keep in mind, I'm competing with my neighbors, such as the Howard County Public School, the Montgomery County Public School, and folks look at salaries. How much does it cost to live in that system where you work? Do I have to travel? What are the work conditions? I was in, I think it was Mr. Barnes' session about mentoring teachers and some of the conditions that folks leave because they're teaching the hardest classes, or their classes become a dumping ground because as an African-American male, maybe you can relate to this African-American male student who wasn't successful. Work conditions. Do I have enough planning time? Do I have the resources? And so some of these little things, I call them little, that are not so much of a budgetary item, some things we just have to look at. I just think of it as the climate and culture. Are we keeping our folks? Are we listening? And are we promoting? But for me, the salaries, what they're teaching, work conditions, and PD, professional development, whether it's what we do as a system or what we partner with our neighboring universities, and we have so many. I just think those are some of the areas to keep our staff and to make it attractive. Because you know what happens after 5 years or 6 years? I was guilty of that. Where do I go? I go into administration. Why? I can make more money. I can work longer months, longer days too. But why not make the teaching profession very attractive so folks can stay and there are opportunities to grow and to be teacher leaders, but to keep folks in the classroom. But you're right on I just think sometimes it's the climate that we have created within our own school that may be discouraging even our students. We have a Teacher Academy of Maryland programs in many of our high schools, and really tapping into our youngsters to go into teaching and give them scholarships. But the retention piece is something I'm definitely looking at with my HR team, and we got some work to do, but it is a budgetary item when we're talking about salaries, bonuses, and we're fortunate that our elected officials recognize that, and I think Kerwin will have a big piece or big role in that, but that recruitment and retention is something we are all struggling with. But I'll get some ideas today. Dr. Reen, you gave me some ideas this afternoon.
Yeah, and one other way that I would elevate just the para to educator pipeline as well. We've had a number of paras going through, ARTC certificated programs. If they had an undergraduate degree, it's an 18-month program by which they can go and actually receive their special ed certification. So to go right from a para to an educator or a teacher as well, which is, I think, enticing to many of them when you talk about salaries.
Yeah.
And then really working with our collective bargaining units, right? Our teachers unions that say, hey, listen, really looking at diversifying pay. I've had my HR team go out to Colorado to look at an opportunity culture, which to Dr. Williams' point is everybody's path didn't necessarily need to be to administration, but how do we promote teacher leaders so that I can remain in the classroom, be deemed a master teacher, and actually receive, a bump or bonus, a bump in pay. But a lot of that is working with our collective bargaining respective unions as well to get them on board to understand that differentiated pay, all things aren't equal. And depending on our high need schools, some people do require that additional bump. And it's no disrespect to the members. It's just the nature of what the job is. So really collectively working with them as well.
Well, I do want to echo that's important. Those areas that are hard to fill, usually in the math, the science, sometimes the languages, absolutely. We do some kind of incentive to try to recruit. But definitely our Grow Your Own, where we are looking at our paras, our adult assistants, working with them to go back to school. Great success where they know the system, right? So they've been with us, they know the system, they know people, and all we have to do is just coach them and work them through with the universities to get their certification. That's an excellent program.
Yeah. So the only thing I'd add to that is one of the things that we also focused on was really trying to remove barriers to culture, and whether it's the actual process for how folks were scheduled for interviews after they apply for a position, or the pools in which we seek applicants. And one that was really important for us was the makeup of the interview panels from the school perspective that interview teachers to go into classrooms, really diversifying structurally how we go about the interview process to allow more applicants of color and applicants that are diverse to actually make it through the process, was really important, especially in a district where, similar to yours, Dr. Peters, it was primarily students of color as our students, but our staff was totally opposite. So over the past 4 years, we've had a significant increase in the number of principals and assistant principals of color, because again, you have to start with the decision makers if you're looking to diversify, so that you can ensure that you can create diverse ranks in the classroom, but also retain the diversity in those ranks over time. So we've seen the trickle down effect of recruiting diversity, but also ensuring that the systems that we utilize to identify our candidates create spaces where diversity is celebrated and appreciated.
Yeah, I think that's critical. Your leadership pipeline, your teacher pipeline is so critical. We've done obviously exhaustive research in our area. I've shared the demographics of our workforce. I've also talked a little bit about we get more teachers of color when the experiences of the students of color get better. Many of our students don't go into teaching because they've not had that experience in their own K-12 life to say, hey, this is something that I want to reinvest in. So it resonates with me, getting leaders of color, because that ensures a lens of diversity. It also, I think, is important that we know that coming out of college, one of the big challenges is student loans. So we've worked with one of our foundations, and we have committed up to $25,000 loan reimbursement over a 3-year commitment, specifically for teachers of color. And then what I've also learned is they don't want to go alone. A lot of times it's tough being that only teacher of color, because you become the disciplinarian. That invisible tax that is placed on you every day is exemplified. I want to there's one question. We've got about 5 minutes left. There's one question in the chat that Rosalie asked. And she said, Rosalie said, how do you advance your equity vision with staff and parents? I know it's a long answer, but if you all three could give me maybe a 1.5 minute answer, how do you advance that equity agenda with your staff and your parents?
So I'll go first and I'll be quick. So the equity agenda for me was identified and pushed through our strategic framework. So being really clear with the equity policy, the strategic framework, and then realigning the organization structurally to support the vision of equity. So we didn't have, here's what we do as an organization, and here's what we do with equity. So we created an Office of Equity, Accountability, and School Improvement. And I put specific offices that reported directly to that office, not parts of them, but specific offices. So parent and community engagement, state and federal programs, all of communications, all of those offices report directly to the Office of Equity, Accountability, and School Improvement. So all of that work and how it gets communicated throughout the organization and the city all drives from the space where the district invests in equity at the deputy superintendent level. So we set the tone and communicate its importance to our community by where we place it, and the offices that do that work and communicate broadly and consistently with our parents and our family and community engagement leg of our organization. Reporting to equity allows the board, the superintendent, the organization to all be kind of on the same page and consistent with how we communicate our vision and goals for equity.
So I'll just add, not only do we have our equity policy, our board has an equity committee. And so they as a group are looking at policies related to equity. And of course, using questions, the equity questions, looking at guiding principles. But when it comes to the work on the administration side, even though we have an equity and cultural proficiency division, each of our focus areas of our strategic plan is associated to an office and is associated to the guiding principles of equity. You can't do the work without looking at equity, and your office progress plans are built upon those questions. How is this impacting certain groups? Are you really targeting students? Are you, as you said, Dr. Parker, looking at differentiated resources? And then Dr. Peters, I just want to put a plug in for the community college. I will tell you the best thing is those partnerships, because they're looking at building success for students, where students are not walking away with loans and it's affordable. So many of our kids are starting in the 2-year program and potentially finishing or transferring to a 4-year program. Great partnerships with our local community college, CCBC.
Yeah, there's really not much more for me to add. I mean, I think for us is, I inherited a equity officer. And so since coming on board, I expanded that to the Office of Equity and Strategic Partnerships. And Dr. Tawanda Bond, who leads that office, serves as a conduit to every aspect of what we do as an organization, right? Whether that's HR. So we take an equity stance as it relates to our recruitment and retention. Academic programs. So now that we're looking at our summer program, it's being run through our equity office. And not just looking at it, I mean, we're looking at it from every aspect of equity, right? Gender identity, race, ethnicity, resource allocation. Not, I think, because it's vogue right now for everyone. And it's interesting over the past year to see how many districts are hiring, and corporations, right, who are hiring equity officers. But it's ultimately what you do with it, to Dr. Parker's point, so that it doesn't just stand in isolation or in addition to. This is a both and, not an either or. And our board is engaged as part of the board committee. We have equity diversity champions, someone identified in each school. They meet regularly. It's from lesson planning, social justice standards. We're looking at the whole gamut. So just making sure that it's a part of everything that we do, not something in addition to what we do.
Simply incredible. The brain trust that's in this room is absolutely extraordinary. Gentlemen, we are at time. I want to thank our panelists for just extraordinary insight into the lives and the work that you've done over the last year. Thank you for the value add that you've brought to this space. Thank you for the work that you're doing for all children, more specifically children of color. The work that you do matters. You matter. We just appreciate your time. So on behalf of just a grateful organization, Bond, MCEL, we really appreciate your time. Be well. This is going to end our conversation. Thank you to all of our participants for chiming in, and all your comments were very powerful. And I think we'll have this video to download soon. But thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'm pretty sure we've got some more sessions to hop in.
We do. So we are running till 3 o'clock when we start to wrap up. So we have 2 more sessions this afternoon. So we hope to have you there. All right. Appreciate you, gentlemen. It was an honor to even be in the same room as you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Be well. We'll reach out to each one of y'all.
Thank you, man. Be blessed.
Take care.
Thank you.